Hey guys, welcome back to more Entitled Karen stories. In this video, a smug neighbor repeatedly parked on my private property and then totally freaks out when she gets towed. Here is what happened. Let's dive right into the video. And the title story starts like this. So I've lived in a lovely suburban village for quite some years now with little to no issues. My house specifically has a larger driveway than the houses either side of me, the paving almost joining up to both neighbors' own driveways, and there's a small fence in between but nothing much to keep the area looking nicer. Along with this driveway I have a garage, which is where I choose to keep my car for safety. A few months back I got a new neighbor and let's just say things did not go well from the very beginning. Excuse me, I heard someone begin banging on my door in the middle of the night. Hello? I asked through the door, not really fancying the idea of opening my door to a random person at this hour. I'm your new neighbor, she shouted back. Okay, nice to meet you. I'll come over and introduce myself in the morning. Excuse me, open this door. She banged once more and reluctantly opened the door. I've just moved in and I expect to be greeted by my new neighbors the second I have. Sorry, I was asleep so I had no idea when you would arrive. Don't be so rude with me. Now then, what is your name? I'm Karen. She stuck out her hand, which I shook. Sorry, you're right, that was rude. I'm Matt. Nice to meet you. Now, I would like to let you know that I'll be using your driveway. What? I asked as she turned away and walked away. I honestly thought I had dreamt that whole interaction the next morning, thinking maybe it was just some reminder to go and introduce myself. However, when I woke up and stepped outside, I was proven wrong. There was a rather large SUV parked slightly over my driveway. It was nothing crazy, I would say maybe a quarter of her car was on my driveway. Already running a tad late for work, I decided to just ignore it for now. Maybe she still needed to move some things in and couldn't use her own driveway for the moment. Still, it didn't explain why she wouldn't just park on the road or use her own garage. Well, anyway, I could still drive around, so I left only to come back later. And well, her SUV was completely on my driveway. I simply couldn't get in. After the awful day at work I had, this was the last thing I needed. I pulled up on the side of the road and knocked on her door. Hello, what do you want? She asked with an eye roll. Rude much. Could you move your car? I asked. No, sorry, she stated, started closing her door. Why not? I asked, holding the door. Because I already told you I would be using your driveway, she shrugged. That doesn't mean you can. You never even said why. I don't want a car cluttering up my own driveway, and yours is plenty big, so I shall be just parking it there, thank you, she tutted, gesturing to my driveway. Well, I'm not allowing you to do that, it's my property. And why ever not? You have a bigger driveway, she replied, getting louder. Well, I don't need a reason if, well, it's my property. But if you want one, it's because I park my car in my garage and cannot get in or out with your SUV in the way. Well then, just park on the road. No, it's my driveway. You park on the road. I will not be parking on the road. I don't want my car on show like that, she tutted. Alright, what about your garage? Nope, that's my DIY workshop. It's not for cars. Look, I sighed. I really don't know what to tell you, other than the fact that you're going to have to move your car. You cannot park there. I don't give you permission, and it's effectively trespassing. We ended up arguing like this for the next 30 minutes, which, to be honest, was at least helping me let off some steam, but it was not going anywhere. She really could not grasp the idea that my driveway was mine and it was not public land. She then started bargaining with me, claiming she would try and not take up the whole thing, maybe only put 3/4 of her SUV over the lines. It was ridiculous and I had no idea how I was gonna win this. Eventually, she agreed to move her car, but the moment my car was in my garage, her SUV was right back in its original spot on my property. For the next week, we played the same game every single day. She would place her car in the way, we would argue for hours. She would eventually move it before putting it back later. It was honestly giving me such a headache. Eventually, I started parking on my driveway instead of in my garage. However, she still managed to fit right in front of my car and block me from leaving. I then tried to go further up and she would just park elsewhere on my driveway. It was so infuriating. Our arguments got louder and more aggressive. At this point we were attracting attention, but to be honest, I did not even care. Another week passed and now we had reached a boiling point. I woke up one morning to see that Karen had once again parked her car in front of mine. Now, I must note that this morning I had a crazy meeting, and so last night I practically pleaded with Karen to move her car for the night. She agreed, but wouldn't you know it, she would put it back and had the other gal to be smirking at me through her window. When I was finally dressed and out of the house, I found that not only was her car parked in right the way of mine, but she had keyed my car. I was furious. She had gone too far. What was the point of doing that? I'd had enough. I stormed inside, called my work to let them know I wouldn't be coming, and phoned a tow truck company. They were here in under an hour and quickly began hooking up Karen's car. "Hey, what on earth are you doing?" she screamed, running out of her house. "My job," the driver replied with a grunt. "I told you not to park on my property, Karen, and this is just the consequence of that." I shrugged with a yawn. "Oh, don't be so petty. I was parking here for a quick second. There was no reason to call a towing company." She put her hands on her hips and tilted her head as if she were scolding a child. "Karen, it's not for a second, and you know it. You will park there for as long as you want. I'm not being petty. This is my property, and I can do what I want with it. And what I do want is for it to not be treated as your public car park." She decided to turn her aggression to the tow truck driver and said, "You, stop what you're doing." "Can't do that, ma'am. You're illegally parked." "I'm not," she yelled, stomping her feet on the ground. From all the yelling, a few of our other neighbors began coming out of their houses to watch the situation unfold. I had told a few of them what was going on, as most of them had noticed her car constantly parked in my driveway, so at least I knew they were more than likely coming out to show me some support more than anything. "I'm gonna sue you," Karen yelled at me. And the next thing I knew, her fist came flying for my face. I managed to dodge it and step back, seeing the tow truck driver out of the corner of my eye, who began phoning the police. "What is wrong with you?" I yelled at Karen, who in retaliation spat at my feet. My neighbors began coming over now. "Oh great, you need backup?" she mocked. She continued screaming, calling me all sorts of insulting names, and then moving on to each and every one of my neighbors to do the same, not forgetting the tow truck driver either. Once her voice was finally in need of a break, she started trying to free her car from the restraints that had been put on it. Not too much luck. That's when the police arrived. "You called the cops!" she yelled, storming up to me again, but this time in my fear I backed away before she could do anything. "Ma'am, stay where you are," one of the officers yelled, coming out of the car. "Oh, officers, thank goodness you are here," she cried, putting on an embarrassing attempt at a pouty face. "What's the problem here?" the same officer asked. "Well, this is my neighbor. She has been parking on my property for the past few weeks and refuses to stop. We have had arguments back and forth, and today I decided to call a towing company, and this is where we are at. And to add, she did assault me," I explained. "What? I would never." "Officers, don't believe this man, he is lying to you," she wailed. "It is true, she punched him," one of our other neighbors stated. "Oh, shut up, Sandra," Karen hissed and then spat at her too. "Ma'am, we are going to need you to calm down and calmly explain your side." "Well, my neighbor here has a bigger driveway than mine, and if I park on mine, all the space is taken up. I cannot park in my garage because I use it for other things, and I don't want to park on the road." "So you think you can just use somebody else's property?" The officer sighed. "Yes," she yelled, throwing up her arms. "I'm glad you finally understand." "No, ma'am, that's not what's happening here. Look, your car is illegally parked, and from the sounds of it, you have no objecting to the fact that this is a feud that's been happening for quite some time. Your car will be towed." Karen continued to wail after this, screaming and crying while her car was towed away. "I will have to pay a fine for that," she screamed before going silent and staring at me. She then took a running start and tackled me to the floor. She didn't try to attack me after the tackle, but was quickly lifted off me. The next few minutes were a blur. First she was quickly shoved into the cop car, then we heard banging coming from inside while she was trying to free herself. Then she somehow did free herself and ran into the middle of the road before continuing her screaming and shouting. The officers got her back in the car, and her wails slowly died down as she was driven off. Somehow, she got off light and was able to find someone to pay for her bail, as she was back the next day with strict warnings to stay away from me and information that a restraining order would be a snap of a finger away. She came over and apologized, and it really did seem sincere. She had her car back, having paid the fine, and parked it right where it belonged, on her property. Since then, she has kept to herself and is clearly embarrassed about the whole situation. Months have passed and I only see her on the odd occasion. There have been no problems since our last blow-up. One thing is for certain though, next time anything like this happens, I'll be sure to set clearer boundaries from the start and not bother to tolerate any behavior which goes against them. And yeah guys, the next one will be a super satisfying story from r/Am I the Jerk. It is titled, "Am I the a-hole for making my high school bully fail his final year after he tried to choke me in elementary school?" And by the way, if you have watched until here, please don't forget to post some star emojis in the comments if you want to support me. This is a story of revenge served ice cold, about 10 years cold to be exact. It started back when I was in 4th grade. There was this kid in my class, Brian, not his real name, who was absolutely obsessed with Cocoa Puffs. I mean, obsessed. He wore Cocoa Puff shirts constantly, talked about them non-stop, and would get weirdly aggressive if anyone said anything about his favorite cereal. Well, one day, he was being particularly intense about it during lunch. He had been rambling about Cocoa Puffs for 20 straight minutes while wearing his favorite Cocoa Puff t-shirt, the one with the bird going crazy that he wore at least twice a week. Everyone at our table was getting annoyed and I finally muttered under my breath, "Geez, you're really cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs." What happened next is still vivid in my memory. Brian's face went completely red and before I could react, he literally launched himself across the table at me. Well, not just reached, full on jumped over everything, sending milk cartons and lunch trays flying. He grabbed me by the throat and started choking me. "Take it back!" he screamed while squeezing my neck. "Take it back right now!" I couldn't even respond because, well, you know, I was being choked. Thankfully, our lunch monitor, Mrs. Ramirez, saw what was happening and rushed over to pull him off of me. By then, I was gasping and had red marks all over my neck. You would think Brian would get in serious trouble for this, right? Well, no, because when we got called to the principal's office, he spun this story about how I had been bullying him about something he loved, even though multiple kids confirmed that I only made that one comment, and it was pretty mild considering his behavior. The school decided we were both at fault, and I got suspended for 3 days for instigating. My parents were furious and tried to fight it, but the principal, Mr. Doyle, would not budge. He said I needed to learn about respecting others' interests. Meanwhile, Brian got the same punishment as me, a 3-day suspension for literally assaulting me. Well, fast forward to senior year of high school. I had not thought much about Brian over the years. We had ended up at the same high school but didn't share many classes. Our paths just didn't cross much, which was fine by me. He still had anger issues from what I heard, but mostly kept to himself. Then came our final semester in design class. I was pretty good at technical drawing and CAD software, and I noticed something weird happening with my work. Every time I would complete a project and save it to my designated folder on the school network, the next day Brian would somehow have an almost identical project to present. At first I thought it was just coincidence. But then I noticed small details, even my minor mistakes being replicated in his work. That is when I remembered something about our school's terrible IT setup, so every student's folder was publicly accessible to anyone on the network. Brian was not just getting inspiration from my work, he was straight up copying it. I decided to do some investigating. I started adding hidden signatures to my projects, tiny details that would be hard to spot unless you knew where to look. And sure enough, those exact details showed up in Brian's submissions every time. I went to our teacher, Mr. Buster, with my concerns. "I understand what you're saying," Mr. Buster said, looking uncomfortable, "but unless I catch him in the act, it's hard to prove. These could be coincidences." "Coincidences? Even the mistakes are identical." Mr. Buster sighed. "Look, Brian needs at least a C in this class to graduate. Well, maybe just try to keep your work more secure." And that is when I learned something interesting. Brian was barely passing his other classes. This design class was his make or break moment for graduation, and he was relying entirely on copying my work to pass. Then I remembered something else, something that made me smile for the first time since discovering the copying. The final project was worth 40% of our grade. It was due right before graduation and we had to submit it digitally through our network folders. I spent 2 weeks creating the perfect trap. I made my actual final project at home on my personal laptop, a complex technical drawing that I knew would get me an A, and then I created a second version, one that looked perfect at first glance but was filled with subtle but critical errors. Wrong measurements, incorrect angles, inconsistent scale, the kind of mistakes that would be obvious to anyone who really understood technical drawing, but might slip past someone who's just copying the work. I saved the flawed version in my school folder a day before the deadline, knowing that Brian would take the bait. Sure enough, when I checked the folder access logs, yeah, our IT system was bad enough that even students could see those. Brian had accessed my folder just hours after I uploaded the file. The day of submission, I came in early and replaced my flawed file with my actual project. When Mr. Buster started grading, I watched Brian's confident smirk slowly fade as our teacher's red pen kept moving across his paper. He failed not just the project, but the entire class. Which meant no graduation for Brian. When he got his grade, he stormed up to my desk, his face that same shade of red that I remembered from elementary school. He hissed, "You did this on purpose. You set me up." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I have no idea what you're talking talking about? Maybe you should have done your own work instead of copying mine all semester long." He tried to complain to Mr. Buster, but that only made things worse. In trying to prove that I had tricked him, he had to admit that he had been copying my work all along. He ended up having to repeat his senior year at a different school. Here is where it gets complicated. Word got around about what happened, and the reactions were mixed. A lot of people thought it was hilarious. This guy who had been copying work all year finally got caught. Others said I went too far, that I deliberately sabotaged someone's graduation over a decade-old grudge. My best friend Dominic pulled me aside after graduation and said, "Dude, I get why you did it, but that was cold. He's going to be held back a whole year." "Yeah, because he chose to cheat instead of doing the work," I replied. "How is that my fault?" "Come on," Dominic said. "Everyone knows you set him up. You could have just reported him for copying. Like I tried to do with Mr. Buster? Fat lot of good that did." The thing is, I didn't just do this because of the elementary school incident. If Brian had shown any remorse over the years or even just left me alone, I probably would have handled it differently, but he never apologized for choking me, and in fact he used to brag about it to other kids like it was funny that he got me suspended for making him attack me. And now years later, here he was still taking advantage of others and expecting to get away with it. Only this time, instead of using physical intimidation, he was stealing my work and potentially affecting my own grades. If teachers saw the identical projects, they might have thought that I was the one copying from him. The fallout has been interesting though. Brian's parents tried to get the school to reverse the grade, claiming I had maliciously interfered with their son's education. The school administration actually called me in for a meeting about it, and well, Principal Yardley looked stern as she asked, "Did you intentionally plant incorrect work to trap Brian?" I stayed calm. I do all my projects multiple times to practice. Sometimes I make mistakes. It's not my responsibility to ensure the quality of work in my personal folder that someone else might choose to copy without permission. They could not prove that I had done anything wrong, and more importantly, they couldn't ignore the fact that Brian had admitted to copying my work all semester. The grade stood. Last I heard, Brian had to repeat his senior year at the neighboring high school. Apparently, he tells everyone it is because he had medical issues last year, but most people know the truth. So here's where I need Reddit's opinion. Maybe what I did was harsh, but wasn't it also justice? Am I the jerk for deliberately setting up my childhood bully to fail his senior year? Comment number 1, everyone sucks here. He was wrong to copy your work, but you deliberately set him up to fail instead of reporting him. That is pretty vindictive. And by the way, Ripe Stars, I would not agree with that at all. I would have actually done the same thing as OP. Also, he did try to report it to the teacher, but the teacher was not interested, so there's no way in hell that OP was the a-hole here. That guy was a disgusting bully, and he absolutely got what he deserved. Comment number 2, you're the a-hole, but justifiably so. Sometimes being an a-hole is the right thing to do, and he had this coming. Comment number 3, not the a-hole. As someone who works in education, you wouldn't believe how many students get away with academic dishonesty because it is hard to prove. You didn't just get revenge, you taught him a valuable life lesson. And before we end the video, we will read a funny story from r/pettyrevenge. It is titled, "She Demanded I Hurry Up." So I was working at a very popular theme park in Florida. When I worked for the resort one year, they had become short on cashiers. My managers noticed that I was fast at whatever task I was given, so they made the glorious decision to have me trained on cash register. Oh, the joy. I was not happy, but I had no choice. My coworker T was tasked with training me. T was a slightly older male who was very goofy, funny, and always inappropriately hit on me. My managers gave me a "I'm earning my ears" tag to put over my name tag so guests would know that I'm in training, and T and I headed to the dining area, and my cashier training then began. Like many resorts, this resort had multiple restaurants or bays to eat at, each serving different things. It also had a bakery/store. This made the register item list quite long, and it was divided over 5 pages. T said I would eventually memorize where everything was as I got better. Things were going well, and I was progressing nicely. Most guests were quite reasonable and understanding when they realized I was still learning. Some even gave words of encouragement, which I greatly appreciated, but then a thin woman with a pointy nose and a frown walked into my line. She had quite a few items, including food and non-food items I was not familiar with. The merchandise items, such as mugs and plastic decorative cups, were in a different location from the food items, so T had to point them out to me. He then returned to the main page and had me do the steps by myself. The woman let out an exasperated breath. T and I turned to look at her. The woman, "Can you hurry up?" Me, "I apologize, I'm in training." Woman, "I don't care, I have other things to do." Well, my petty box was immediately turned to on as I grabbed her first item. I slowly scanned it. I grabbed the mug, turning it over ever so slowly to find the price. Like a paralyzed slug, I slowly found the proper merchandise page and rung up the item. The woman's face turned a brilliant shade of red while T struggled to suppress his laughter. When possible, I kept eye contact with her as I took my sweet time ringing up each of her items like a blind sloth. She was seething as I narrowed my gaze before giving her her total. She angrily threw her card down on the counter. I picked it up, taking my time completing the transaction before tossing the card and receipt back on the counter. Me, have a magical day. And the woman gave me a death glare. And yeah guys, thank you for watching, please subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again tomorrow.